It's the height of summer in 1942, and beneath an ink-black canopy of stars scattered across the North African sky, a convoy of 18 military jeeps snakes its way through the hostile desert terrain. The British Special Operations Unit is under the command of Major David Stirling, a man leading his hand-picked soldiers on what might be the most audacious mission of the entire North African campaign. Their objective lies 230 miles to the northwest of Cairo, a vital German aviation base positioned far beyond the front lines, deep within territory controlled by the enemy. Despite having complete faith in the capabilities and courage of the men accompanying him on this dangerous undertaking, Stirling can't shake a gnawing sense of unease that's been building inside him throughout the journey. His eyes scan the horizon repeatedly, searching for any sign of their destination. The question keeps running through his mind, becoming more urgent with each passing moment. They should have reached the airfield by now. According to every calculation, every map reference, every piece of intelligence they received, the target should be directly in front of them at this very moment. The darkness around them seems impenetrable, revealing nothing. Then, without any warning whatsoever, the oppressive darkness of the desert night is suddenly shattered by what appears to be hundreds upon hundreds of blazing lights. For a brief, heart-stopping instant, Stirling's first thought is that their presence has been detected, that the enemy has somehow discovered their approach and illuminated the area to expose them. His muscles tense as adrenaline floods his system. However, it's only when the unmistakable deep rumble of powerful aircraft engines cuts through the stillness of the night that understanding dawns on him. One of the Luftwaffe's planes is making its final approach, preparing to touch down at the very airfield they've come to destroy. Positioned to Stirling's left side are two legendary figures of the Special Air Service Unit. Captain Paddy Mayne, a man whose reputation for courage and ferocity in combat has already become the stuff of soldiers' tales, gazes at the illuminated airfield with an almost appreciative expression on his weathered face. His voice carries a note of genuine admiration as he speaks to his commanding officer, remarking on what a magnificent sight it presents. Beside Mayne sits Lieutenant Carol Mather, another officer whose competence and bravery have been proven time and again in the harsh crucible of desert warfare. On Stirling's opposite side, a contingent of French Special Air Service soldiers waits with barely contained anticipation. Their leader, a young officer named aspirant André Zirnheld, sits forward in his seat, his entire body coiled like a spring, his eyes fixed on Stirling, waiting with obvious eagerness for the order that will unleash them upon the enemy. Stirling takes one final moment to assess the situation, then delivers the command his men have been waiting to hear. His voice is calm, but carries an unmistakable note of determination as he tells them it's time to begin their work. Throughout the column of vehicles, men immediately move to their designated positions at the weapons systems. Each jeep has been specially modified to carry twin Vickers machine guns, one pair mounted at the front of the vehicle, another at the rear. The weapons are chambered for .303 caliber ammunition, and each one is capable of delivering devastating firepower. The gunners take their places behind the weapons, checking their fields of fire, making final adjustments to their position. Once each crew signals their readiness to commence the assault, Stirling doesn't hesitate.
He shouts their motto, the phrase that has come to define their entire unit and its philosophy. The words ring out across the desert. Those who have the courage to take risks will emerge victorious. The moment the words leave his lips, the engines of all 18 jeeps roar into life almost simultaneously, shattering the relative quiet. The line of vehicles begins to advance, picking up speed as they go. They surge forward across the desert sand, charging directly toward the enemy position like cavalry from a bygone era, except these modern warriors ride machines instead of horses. When the attacking force reaches approximately 800 meters from the perimeter of the airfield, something remarkable happens. The somewhat disorganized column of jeeps, which moments ago appeared to be simply a loose grouping of vehicles moving in roughly the same direction, suddenly transforms into a precisely ordered formation. It's as if an invisible hand has arranged them into a perfect line abreast. Stirling's vehicle takes the central position, serving as the anchor point for the entire formation, while Zirnheld and the other unit commanders position their jeeps to create a uniform line extending to either side of him. Then comes the moment that one of the commandos present that night, a soldier named Stephen Hastings, would later describe in vivid detail. According to his account, there was an almost tentative beginning, one brief experimental burst of gunfire that seemed to hang alone in the air for just a moment. But that single burst was immediately followed by the full, overwhelming chaos of 68 machine guns all opening fire at once, creating a wall of sound and fury that defied description. The sheer force generated by the guns causes the jeeps themselves to shake and vibrate violently, rattling every bolt and rivet as streams of bullets spray outward toward the target in a seemingly random pattern that nevertheless creates an inescapable web of fire. Each pair of twin Vickers guns is now cycling at an incredible rate, 1,000 rounds per minute, with With 34 pairs of guns firing simultaneously, that translates to an absolutely staggering 34,000 individual rounds of ammunition screaming across the brightly lit runway every 60 seconds. Each bullet capable of shredding any aircraft unfortunate enough to be in its path into twisted fragments of metal. From the perspective of the German personnel on the ground at the airfield, what they're witnessing must seem like something from a nightmare. All they can perceive is a solid wall of fire and an ear-splitting noise of noise. Red and white tracer rounds zip through the air toward them like angry hornets, each one marking the path of dozens of invisible bullets following the same trajectory. The tracers tear through everything they encounter: metal, glass, rubber, flesh, while incendiary rounds designed specifically for destroying aircraft strike fuel tanks and ignite them, turning planes into massive torches that burn with fierce intensity. For the German soldiers trying to comprehend what's happening to them, it presents a truly terrifying spectacle.
The German U-52 transport aircraft that had been making its landing approach spots the streams of tracer fire streaking across the runway below, but the crew faces an impossible situation. They're already committed to their final approach, too low and too slow to safely abort the landing and climb away. They have no choice but to continue and hope they can somehow survive what awaits them. The aircraft's wheels touch down on the runway and the pilots are already beginning their landing roll when the German defenders make a crucial decision. Someone hits the master switch and instantly all the airfield lighting cuts out, plunging the entire base back into total darkness. The attacking vehicles cease firing immediately, but anyone who thinks the assault is over couldn't be more mistaken. This is merely the end of the first phase of a carefully planned operation. Stirling reaches for a flare gun and raises it above his head, aiming skyward. He pulls the trigger and the flare arcs high into the night sky before igniting, bathing the desert landscape below in an eerie green glow. He shouts the command to advance, and the jeeps respond instantly, surging forward onto the airfield proper. Stirling's vehicle leads the way, with Zirnheld's right behind him, and the rest of the attacking force follows in a tight, disciplined formation that has been practiced until it became second nature. They arrange themselves into two parallel columns, with each column maintaining a spacing of approximately 4.5 meters between vehicles. The formation resembles a deadly arrowhead, with Stirling's jeep forming the very tip of that arrowhead, pointing directly at the heart of the enemy position. The machine guns open up again, this time at point-blank range against the parked German aircraft. They systematically destroy Stuka dive bombers, those distinctive aircraft with their bent wing profiles that have become symbols of German air power. Once the Stukas have been reduced to burning wreckage, the gunners shift their fire to the Bf-109 fighters, the backbone of the Luftwaffe's combat capability. Nothing receives mercy or escapes destruction. U-88 medium bombers, Bf-110 heavy fighters, U-52 transport planes, every aircraft representing the pride and power of the German Air Force erupts into flames that light up the desert night like enormous candles. For the German troops stationed at the airfield, the situation rapidly deteriorates into a complete catastrophe. They've been caught entirely unprepared, with no warning whatsoever, and the shock of the sudden, overwhelming assault leaves many of them paralyzed with confusion and fear. Some of the soldiers, in their panic and desperation to find any kind of cover, make the fatal mistake of hiding beneath the parked aircraft. It proves to be a tragically poor decision that many of them won't survive to regret. The crew of the J-52 that just landed scrambles frantically inside their cockpit, their hands moving rapidly across switches and controls as they desperately try to shut down their cockpit lighting and kill their engines, hoping against hope that they can somehow blend in with the other aircraft and escape notice in the chaos and darkness. Meanwhile, the line of attacking jeeps crawls forward down the runway at an almost leisurely pace, merely 2.5 miles per hour, barely faster than a person walking at a brisk pace. Yet despite this slow speed, they roll all the way down the entire length of the runway without encountering any organized resistance, leaving behind them a trail of destruction and chaos. The Ju-52 and its terrified crew find themselves caught directly in the middle of this storm of fire and death. The convoy reaches the far end of the runway and begins to turn toward the taxiway, where intelligence reports have indicated that additional aircraft are parked and waiting. Stirling raises his hand and signals for the column to halt. He quickly performs a visual inspection, counting vehicles and checking positions to ensure that all his jeeps remain in formation and no one has been separated from the group. Satisfied that everyone is still with him and in position, he gives the signal to proceed, and the rampage of destruction continues as they move down the taxiway toward their next targets.
However, that brief pause, which lasted perhaps only 30 seconds, gives the German defenders something they desperately needed: a moment to collect themselves and mount some form of organized response. A small group of German soldiers, overcoming their initial shock and confusion, makes a dash toward a defensive position they know contains weapons. They reach a 20mm Breda anti-aircraft gun and grab several portable mortar tubes. One German soldier, his voice hoarse with desperation
frustration and urgency, shouts to his comrades that they failed to stop the attackers now, everything will be lost. The entire airfield, all the aircraft, perhaps their very lives. They quickly set up one of the mortars and fire it. Stirling hears a distinctive whistling sound overhead, that particular noise that experienced soldiers learn to recognize and fear. Then the first mortar round impacts, exploding in the center of the formation, landing in the space between the two columns of jeeps. The explosion nearly takes out Zirnheld and several other soldiers whose vehicles are closest to the impact point. Following this near miss, the German anti-aircraft guns and Italian Breda cannons begin to fire what witnesses would later describe as wildly at the British soldiers, though even wildfire can be deadly when there's enough of it. Bullets whistle through the air over the heads of the commandos, forcing them to duck down as low as they can possibly get in their jeeps while trying to maintain control of their vehicles. The enemy barrage sweeps through their formation like a deadly wind. One of the gunners, a trooper named John Robson, suddenly jerks backward and then slumps forward over his machine gun, his body going limp. He's been hit by enemy fire. The situation is becoming critical. They need to eliminate that Breda gun position before it inflicts even more casualties. Stirling shouts above the noise to his gunner, Sergeant Johnny Cooper, ordering him to take out that gun position. As Johnny swivels his weapon to engage the Breda, one of its shells crashes directly through Stirling's jeep, passing between his legs and missing his knees by mere inches, a distance that could be measured in single digits of centimeters. It's a miss that saves his ability to ever walk again. Stirling's jeep shudders and then grinds to a complete halt. The engine has died. Stirling's voice rises in frustration as he demands to know why the vehicle won't move, why it stopped at this critical moment. His driver's response is simple and devastating. They haven't got an engine anymore. The shell that passed through their jeep has destroyed something vital, rendering the vehicle immobile. But there's no time to dwell on this setback because another jeep quickly pulls up alongside them to provide rescue. It's Robson's jeep, now without its gunner, and as Stirling climbs aboard, he's confronted with a horrible sight that will stay with him for the rest of his life. The young soldier, John Robson, is lying dead on the back of his own jeep, and what remains of his head rests against the very gun he was firing when enemy fire found him. Stirling shouts the order to go, to keep moving, and his new jeep accelerates to rejoin the column, which hasn't stopped its assault despite the enemy resistance. The men continue to pound the enemy position with sustained machine gun fire. Mortar rounds keep falling around them, each explosion shaking the ground beneath their vehicles and sending deadly fragments of shrapnel spinning through the air in all directions. But the men of the Special Air Service refuse to let up or slow down. Their concentrated fire rips into the enemy position with devastating effect. The Germans manning the Breda guns and the mortar crews find themselves completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of incoming fire. They begin to fall, one after another, and those who survive long enough to realize the hopelessness of their situation break and run, fleeing for their lives into the darkness of the desert.
When the column finally reaches the end of the taxiway, having completed another run of destruction, Stirling honks his horn, prearranged signal, and orders a complete stop. All the jeeps come to a halt and form up around his position. He shouts for them to shut off their engines so that he can make himself heard without competing with the noise of running motors. As the engines die one by one, an almost ghostly silence descends over the airfield, broken only by the crackling roar of flames. The fire consuming what used to be multiple squadrons of Luftwaffe aircraft has grown into a massive bonfire that illuminates the scene with flickering orange light. Stirling calls out, asking if everyone is okay, if there are any wounded who need immediate attention. The responses come back from different directions. Affirmative replies in English, a French oui from Zirnheld's group. Stirling feels a wave of relief wash over him when he realizes that, miraculously, John Robson appears to be their only fatality. It's a remarkably low casualty rate given the intensity of the combat they've just experienced, but he needs to know their ammunition status before deciding on the next move. He calls out, asking how much ammunition each vehicle has remaining. The answers come back quickly. One gunner reports half a drum remaining, another calls out 1 drum, a third reports 2 drums still available. When Stirling processes this information, he realizes they've still got plenty of ammunition left, more than enough to continue the mission. There's no logical reason to leave the job half-finished when they have the means to continue. He makes his decision and announces it to his men. They're going to make one more pass over this section of the dispersal area where aircraft are parked, and then they'll leave. But he adds a warning, telling them to watch out for those damned Breda guns, the ones that have already cost them 1 man and nearly killed several others. The engines roar back to life throughout the formation, a sound that's becoming almost comforting in its familiarity, and the column heads toward the edge of the airfield where more targets await. They drive past scenes of incredible destruction, shredded aircraft, burning wreckage, twisted metal scattered across the ground, the results of their handiwork. Among all this debris and devastation, they spot one aircraft that appears to have somehow escaped damage, a Bf-109 fighter that's still intact. The gunners immediately open fire on it, and within seconds, it's
transformed from a functional aircraft into nothing more than a pile of twisted metal scrap, just another piece of wreckage on a field full of wreckage. Stirling reaches for his flare gun one final time and raises it into the air. He pulls the trigger, and this time the flare that arcs into the sky burns with a red glow instead of green. This is the prearranged signal for withdrawal, for retreat. Their mission is complete, their work is done, or at least that's what Stirling believes. But bathed in the red glow of the retreat flare, the legendary officer Paddy Mayne's sharp eyes spot something that everyone else has missed: an untouched U-52 transport aircraft sitting among all the wrecks, somehow overlooked in the chaos.
Without asking permission, without announcing his intentions, without any warning whatsoever, Paddy suddenly leaps out of his moving jeep. Stirling, seeing this unexpected action, calls out Paddy's name in surprise and concern. But Paddy is already running toward the aircraft, and he's carrying something in his hand: a bomb. He reaches the U-52, quickly places the explosive device on top of the aircraft's wing where it will do maximum damage, then turns and sprints back toward his jeep. He jumps aboard and shouts to his driver to get moving, to get them out of there. Behind them, the U-52 erupts into flames, adding one more funeral pyre to the night as the SAS men speed off into the darkness of the desert, their mission truly complete now. The Germans will undoubtedly send aircraft out at first light to search for the raiders, to hunt them down and exact revenge for the devastating attack. But the SAS men have anticipated this response and have prepared for it. Their convoy of jeeps splits up into 4 separate groups, each heading in a different direction, making it much more difficult for the enemy to track and locate them. One of these groups is commanded by Lieutenant Carroll Mather. His unit drives through what remains of the night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the destroyed airfield. Then, as the first light of dawn begins to creep across the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, they find a location with thick, dense bushes that will provide both concealment and some protection from the brutal sun that will soon be beating down on them. They carefully maneuver their jeeps into the bushes, trying to make them as invisible as possible from the air. Once they're satisfied with their concealment, the men decide it's time for breakfast. After all the adrenaline and tension of the night raid, they're all hungry and exhausted. Someone gets out the cooking equipment and food supplies, and soon they've got sausages sizzling in a pan and water rumbling toward a boil for tea or coffee. The ordinary domestic sounds and smells of cooking seem almost surreal in this context, just hours after such violence and destruction. But then, over the homey sounds of breakfast being prepared, they hear something else, something that sends a chill down every spine. Someone calls out a warning. There's an aircraft approaching. A German dive bomber passes overhead, its distinctive engine note unmistakable. As it flies past and then begins to circle back around, every man feels sweat beginning to drip down his face, though whether it's from the heat or from fear is hard to say. They remain absolutely motionless, barely daring to breathe, watching the aircraft's movements. The plane circles once, twice, and then continues on its way. With collective sighs of relief, the men realize that the German pilot hasn't spotted them, that their concealment has worked. So they return to cooking their meal, trying to relax and recover from the night's exertions. But then, just as they're beginning to think they might actually be safe, someone spots another aircraft in the distance, and then another one appears, and another after that. Mather, watching this development with growing concern, mutters under his breath that it's like watching a swarm of angry bees, and his comparison is apt. There are multiple German aircraft now crisscrossing the sky above them, clearly searching for something. Then his muttering stops and his voice rises to a shout as he orders his men to take cover immediately. All 12 men abandon their breakfast and dive under the bushes, making themselves as small and invisible as possible, praying that the vegetation will hide them from the searching eyes above.
Meanwhile, the French group under Zirnheld's command finds themselves in a dangerously exposed position. They're out in the open desert with very little cover available, and time is running out as they hear the sound of aircraft engines growing louder in the distance. They manage to locate a small ridge, really nothing more than a minor elevation in the ground, and they hide their vehicles on the protected side of it. But everyone knows it's not enough cover, that if the Germans search this area thoroughly, they'll be spotted. And sure enough, they too hear the roar of engines growing closer and closer. Zirnheld begins scanning the sky, his eyes moving rapidly back and forth, searching for the threat. Then, his eyes lock onto the incoming aircraft and stop moving. He can see them now. 4 German Stuka dive bombers, those distinctive planes with their inverted gull wings and fixed landing gear, heading directly toward their position. There's no doubt about it. They've been spotted. The Germans know exactly where they are. Zirnheld's voice cuts through the air with an urgent command, telling his men not to move, to remain absolutely still. Every soldier freezes in place, as if by not moving, they might somehow become invisible. But it doesn't work. The Stukas adjust their course, lining up their attack run, heading straight for the hidden French position. Zirnheld realizes the futility of remaining still and shouts a new order, telling everyone to take cover, to find whatever protection they can. In a flash, in the blink of an eye, bullets begin to rain down upon their positions like deadly hail. The soldiers find themselves caught in a devastating storm of lead and sand, with bullets kicking up geysers of sand all around them, ricochets winding off the rocks, and the screaming sound of diving aircraft filling the air. While this attack is taking place, Stirling's group is engaged in a much more somber
somber task. They're burying their fallen comrade, John Robson, the young trooper who gave his life during the raid. They don't see any German planes in their area, and they use this moment of relative calm and safety to give Robson a proper military funeral, or as proper as circumstances allow. It's a simple ceremony, but conducted with genuine respect and honor. When they finished covering the grave, they mark it off with a makeshift cross constructed from tin cans. It's crude, but it's all they have, and it ensures that the grave is marked, that Robson's resting place won't be lost in the vastness of the desert. But even this quiet, dignified service is interrupted by the sound of an aircraft engine. The sound freezes every man in place. They look up slowly, their eyes scanning the sky, and then they lock eyes with another Stuka bomber passing overhead. For a moment that seems to stretch for an eternity, they wait for the plane to turn, to attack, to signal that they've been spotted. But thankfully, mercifully, the German pilot apparently doesn't see them. The plane continues on its course without deviating, and soon disappears from view. The men let out breaths they didn't realize they'd been holding.
Back at the location where the French group had hidden, it appears for a moment that they might have survived the attack relatively unscathed. Despite all the noise, all the chaos, all the bullets and explosions, everyone seems to be accounted for and unhurt. Then the German planes, which had flown off after their first attack run, bank hard and turn back toward the French position. The Stukas resume their attack, making multiple passes, diving and firing and then climbing away to turn and dive again. They keep attacking for several minutes, which feels like hours to the men on the ground, until finally they exhaust their ammunition. As the planes finally fly away for good, heading back toward their own base, the desert wind becomes the only sound remaining in the area. That and another sound, a slow, labored, painful breathing that seems too loud in the sudden quiet. The second in command of the French unit, an officer named Francois Martin, stumbles back to his feet, still dizzy from the concussion of nearby explosions. What he sees as he looks around is pure carnage. 2 of their 3 jeeps have been wrecked, torn apart by gunfire, and rendered completely unusable. And there's a man lying on the ground, not moving. Martin moves closer and his heart sinks. It's Zirnheld, their leader. He's been hit, and badly. There's a wound in his stomach and another in his shoulder, and both are bleeding heavily. The men carefully lift their wounded commander as gently as they can and place him in the one remaining jeep that's still functional. Then they speed away from the attack site as fast as the damaged vehicle can manage, heading for the rendezvous point and hoping against hope that they can get Zirnheld to medical help in time. Night falls at last, bringing relief from the punishing heat of the sun, and Mather's group continues pushing onward through the desert. His men are thirsty despite having water, sunburnt despite their attempts to protect themselves, and desperate to reach safety. But at least they're alive, and that's more than can be said for some. It doesn't take Mather's group very long to locate the prearranged rendezvous point. The navigation has been good, and they arrive without incident. Soon after they reach the rendezvous point, they're joined by Paddy Mayne's unit, which reports that they didn't face much resistance from German search planes and had a relatively uneventful journey back. Stirling's group is also making their way back toward the rendezvous point. But for them, the journey is proving to be just as much of an enemy as the Germans they fought at the airfield. The terrain in this part of the desert is particularly treacherous, with hidden obstacles and difficult ground. One of their jeeps loses a tire. Not just gets a flat, but actually loses the entire tire from the wheel. The vehicle becomes impossible to drive, and the men are forced to abandon it where it sits. They redistribute themselves among the remaining vehicles, cramming more men into each jeep than is comfortable, and from this point forward, their progress slows to a crawl. Every mile becomes a struggle. To make their situation even worse, they're having trouble with navigation. They can't seem to find any of the landmarks they were told to look for, the features of terrain that should have guided them back to safety. The horrible truth gradually becomes impossible to ignore. They're lost. They're somewhere in the vast desert, but exactly where is anyone's guess, and their supplies of food, water, and fuel are all running dangerously low. If they can't figure out where they are and find the rendezvous point soon, they may never leave this desert alive. The sand could become their tomb just as surely as German bullets.
After much discussion and debate about their options, they make a decision that goes against all their training and instincts. They decide to keep moving during daylight hours, despite the risk of being spotted from the air. It's a calculated gamble. Staying put means certain death from thirst and exposure, while moving at least gives them a chance, however slim, of finding the rendezvous point. But as they drive through the daylight hours, they find themselves completely and utterly lost. Every direction looks the same. Every dune and rocky outcrop could be anywhere in hundreds of square miles of desert. Stirling stares out at the endless, featureless, completely unrecognizable desert landscape stretching to the horizon in every direction. He fights to push back the negative thoughts that keep trying to force their way into his mind. The thoughts that whisper they're going to die out here, that they've survived the Germans only to be killed by thirst and sand and sun. According to the navigator's calculations, based on compass headings and estimated distance
distance is traveled, they're heading in approximately the right direction. It's not much to hang hope on, but it's all they have. They just have to keep going, keep driving, and hope desperately that the navigator's calculations are correct. They continue moving all day long under the absolutely scorching sun, which beats down on them mercilessly. But still they can't find anything they recognize, any landmark or feature that appears on their maps or in their memories. Before long, they find their path blocked by a steep escarpment, a cliff or very steep slope that their heavily loaded jeeps simply cannot climb. They're stuck, unable to go forward. The navigator hops out of his jeep, his legs stiff from the long hours of sitting, and heads toward the edge of the cliff. He's hoping to find a way down, a path or route that the vehicles might be able to navigate. When he reaches the edge and looks down, his eyes light up with an expression of pure joy and relief. At the bottom of the escarpment, parked in a defensive formation, are British jeeps, SAS vehicles at the rendezvous point. They found it. Against all odds, despite being lost, despite their navigation difficulties, they've actually made it. The navigator turns and runs back toward the others, waving his arms wildly in the air, a huge smile on his face. He's shouting the words that everyone has been desperate to hear. They've made it. They're safe. They've found the rendezvous. Stirling's group finally reaches their designated hideout on July 29, 2 full days after the raid on the airfield. It should be a moment of celebration, of congratulations and relief, but the atmosphere at the rendezvous point is somber rather than joyful. As the French soldiers race across the desert in their one remaining jeep, Martin does everything he possibly can to provide first aid to the wounded Zirnheld. He uses field dressings to try to stop the bleeding, gives him water, does everything he's been trained to do, but deep down, he knows it's no use. He can see the signs, and they're all bad.
With every second that passes, every minute that ticks by, Zirnheld's skin becomes paler, losing its healthy color and taking on a waxy, gray appearance. His breathing becomes slower and more labored, each breath more difficult than the last. Meanwhile, his heart races faster and faster, beating rapidly as his body desperately tries to compensate for the blood loss, tries to keep enough oxygen flowing to his vital organs. By the time they spot the rendezvous point in the distance, by the time safety is finally in sight, all hope is lost, and everyone knows it. Most of all, Zirnheld himself knows it. He's a soldier, and he's seen enough wounded men to recognize his own condition. He reaches out and pulls Martin close to him, gathering what little strength he has remaining. In a voice barely above a whisper, he speaks his final words to his friend and comrade. He tells Martin that he's going to leave them now, that his time has come, but he wants Martin to know that he's at peace, that he's ready, that he has no regrets. With those final words spoken, André Zirnheld takes his last breath and passes away, dying as he had lived, serving his country with courage and honor. In recognition of his extraordinary leadership and courage during the raid, David Stirling would later be awarded both the Distinguished Service Order and the Order of the British Empire, two of Britain's highest military honors. And just a few months after the raid that cost John Robson and André Zirnheld their lives, L Detachment, which had been the unit's somewhat informal designation, would officially become known by a name that would become legendary in military history, the Special Air Service, or SAS. In the weeks following the raid, while going through Zirnheld's personal belongings to prepare them for return to his family, Martin discovered a poem that his friend had written. The poem reflected Zirnheld's thoughts about duty, sacrifice, and the life of a soldier. In the years since then, that poem has become known as the Paratrooper's Prayer, and it has been adopted as the official poem of the French Airborne Forces, recited at ceremonies and remembered by generations of soldiers who came after. Zirnheld's words lived on, inspiring others long after his death in the desert. The raid on the airfield would go down as one of the most successful special operations of the entire North African campaign. The damage inflicted on the Luftwaffe that night was substantial. Dozens of aircraft destroyed or heavily damaged, fuel supplies destroyed, and the airfield itself rendered temporarily unusable. More importantly, the raid proved that small, highly trained units operating behind enemy lines could inflict damage far out of proportion to their size. The techniques and tactics developed by Stirling and his men would influence special operations doctrine for decades to come, shaping how modern special forces units around the world operate. The men who participated in that raid, those who survived and those who didn't, had demonstrated something profound about courage, determination, and the capability of soldiers who dared to take risks. They had driven hundreds of miles through enemy territory, launched a devastating attack against a heavily defended target, and most of them had made it home. The price had been high. 2 good men lost, but the mission had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. In the brutal arithmetic of war, it was considered a victory, though that knowledge provided little comfort to the families of Robson and Zirnheld. In the broader context of the war, this single raid might seem like a small incident, just one operation among thousands that took place across North Africa during those years. But its impact extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. It demonstrated that the enemy could be struck anywhere, at any time, that no position was truly safe if determined soldiers could find a way to reach it. That psychological impact, that sense of vulnerability, affected German operations throughout the theater. Command
Commanders had to divert resources to defending rear areas, to protecting facilities that should have been safe, and those were resources that couldn't be used at the front lines. The men of the SAS would go on to conduct many more raids throughout the North African campaign, and later in Europe, they would refine their techniques, develop new tactics, and continue to prove the value of special operations. But that night in July 1942, when 18 jeeps charged across a German airfield under the light of flares and burning aircraft, when Paddy Mayne jumped from his jeep to place one last bomb, when John Robson fell at his gun and André Zirnheld breathed his last in the desert, that night would always hold a special place in the unit's history. It was the night that proved they could do what they said they could do, that showed the concept worked, that demonstrated the SAS was more than just an idea or an experiment. It was real, it was effective, and it was here to stay. The legacy of that raid, and of the men who conducted it, continues to this day. Special Forces units around the world still study the tactics used that night, still learn from both the successes and the mistakes. The principles demonstrated in that desert raid, surprise, speed, violence of action, and rapid withdrawal, remain fundamental to Special Operations doctrine. And the motto that Stirling shouted as they began their attack, those 4 words about daring and winning, continues to inspire soldiers who follow in their footsteps, carrying on a tradition that was forged in the fire and chaos of that North African night.